again. In this final unit on interpersonal communication theories, we're going to be looking at rules theory and relational communication. And we have our guest speaker with us again, and I'll reintroduce her shortly. Let me just remind you that when we looked at types of theories, we looked at laws perspectives, systems perspectives, rules perspectives, and said that rules had less force than did laws or systems. And in our previous interpersonal units, we looked at stages of how relationships develop, how those fall apart, some of the strategies that we can use to test the quality of those relationships, some of the strategies that we use on each other in those. And we have with us today Dr. Williamson, Robin Williamson, who is chairman at the University of St. Thomas, and one of her specialties is relational communication. She did doctoral research in this area of marital typologies, and she's going to be talking with you today about some of the specifics of rules and how those rules are applicable in interpersonal relationships, and particularly how they affect relational communication. So, Dr. Williamson, welcome back.
Thank you. We're first going to talk about rules theory per se. How many of you have read this little book? The Driver's Ed book?
Oh.
The Driver's Ed handbook. My youngest son, this is a major passage in my life, has just gotten his driver's permit. Gasp. This little book here, of course, is full of rules. It helps us coordinate our behavior on the road. Now, there are many different other kinds of rules that we need in interpersonal communication, and really communication per se, that helps us coordinate and manage our relationships with other people. Think about a situation where you went to maybe a new party with a group of people that you had never known before, or maybe you went to a new university, or maybe you went to a job interview. How did all of those situations make you feel? Anybody? Were you uncomfortable a little bit? Maybe? Well, the reason why you were uncomfortable was because you didn't know the rules. You didn't know the particular expectations of those kind of situations. So we're going to talk a little bit about rules and rules theory, what they do to us, and then we'll get into the relational rules area, which tells us about rules in relationships. Now, rules theory per se emerged from the criticisms of symbolic interactionism. Now, Dr. MHAUN has already talked to you about symbolic interactionism, certainly one of the most interesting theories of social management, language, and relationships. Now, there have been a lot of criticisms of this area. First of all, that this was a non-empirical theory. Mead created this theory out of qualitative rather than quantitative research. He ignored variables like emotion and societal organization, and concepts, major concepts like mind, self, and society were not used consistently. This is what the rules theory people criticize about symbolic interactionism. So what they set to do, or what they set out to do, was make a theory that was more conceptually sound. The common assumptions of the rules perspective, which are really very similar to symbolic interactionism, are that people choose courses of action to accomplish their intentions. This is very much like Mead. That people try to figure out both language and behaviors that achieve their goals. You know, think of you. You take classes, you study, you exchange notes in order to do well in your classes so that you can achieve your particular goal, a degree from the university. The second idea is that social behavior is structured and organized. As random as our lives may seem sometimes, they are not random. They are structured and organized. we pretty much do the same thing every day according to certain kinds of rules. And the reason why we do that is because our behavior is not random. It's goal-oriented. It's intentional. And so therefore, we don't behave randomly. And thirdly, rules are the mechanisms through which social action is organized. Now, for us, because we are human beings, that social action is symbolic in some way. We have words or we have some other kind of sign or signal that helps us coordinate our behavior with other people. Going back to our handbook of the rules of the road, what would happen if we all decided that we were going to drive where we wanted to? We would have chaos, wouldn't we? Do you remember during the flood, people panicked and they drove up and down the wrong side of the highway? They were breaking the rules. And fortunately, at least I don't think there were any horrible accidents, but there could have been because people were breaking the rules. We have to follow certain kinds of social rules in order for our lives to function effectively. Now, there have been a variety of different kinds of ways that people have done research in this area, and there are numerous applications. Probably the most common area is linguistics, and basically what the linguistics people study basically are how grammars are developed, and especially in a Chomskyan kind of way. We talked about Chomsky in previous lectures, how we produce novel sentences. And so the linguistic people have tried to figure out how rules affect us. Transformational rules, different kinds of grammatical rules help us move from known situations to novel situations through language. Now, a second way that the rules people have applied their particular theories to areas of study are the philosophy of language or the philosophy of action types of approaches. These are how people create speech in order to achieve goals. You know, think of the area of advertising. Advertising is a magnificent organized language system to impact our buying behavior or sometimes our behavior in general. Okay, so that's one particular idea there. Also, any persuasive theory would be certainly how people create speech in order to achieve goals, in order to influence other people. And then lastly, the area of cognitive development, how people conceptualize and solve problems using rules. And this has to do with behavioral adaptation. Now, I had a bit of a challenge this morning, again, getting here. There's nothing like trying to get somewhere by 8 o'clock. So I had to do a little behavioral adaptation again. I used signals around on the highway, lots of red lights and stopping cars, to tell me that I sure better get off that freeway and go an alternative route or I would miss this class because the traffic was terrible today. So this cognitive development area tells us or helps us to conceptualize how we use signs and symbols and rules to accomplish our intention through behavioral adaptation. So these are a few preliminary ideas that help us figure out how people have used rules theories. There are three primary rule approaches that these types of theorists have used. The first one is called the rule following approach. Now, this is where rules are seen as observed behavioral regularities. This is where we're looking for expected behaviors. Many linguistic theories follow this. If you speak a particular language, there are phonological or sound rules that you have to follow. There are word order rules that you have to follow. You wouldn't say, the house brown is. You just don't say that in English. You might say it in another language, but you don't say it in English. You have to follow the rules in order for your linguistic structure to have meaning. Then we have the rule-governed approach. Now, the rule-governed approach has to do with intentions and accepted ways of achieving them. What should or should not be done in a particular situation. For example, suppose you want to go see Dr. MHAUN in her office, and she already has somebody else in her office. Well, probably you would follow the rule of not interrupting by barging in there and demanding that she see you immediately. That would probably not go over real well. You instead would wait patiently in the hall till the person that she is talking to has already left. That is one of those functional rules of society that we use, that we do not interrupt other people when they are already engaged. We wait politely until they're finished. So the rule-governed approach looks at all kinds of situations like that, what should not be done in certain kinds of situations. And then lastly, the rule-using approach. This is the most complicated of the three approaches. This one looks at the appropriate rule choice according to our intentions and according to a particular situation. For example, in this type of rule-using approach, you have many different kinds of choices to accomplish your ends. Let's look at the game of football, for example. You all, I'm sure, go to the U of H football games. I went to USC, so I went to the USC football games, which I enjoyed thoroughly. There are many ways to get down the field and make points. You know, you can have that wonderful, catch it as they kick it off and run all the way down. That's really exciting. Or you can slog down the field 10 yards at a time. You can run and pass and play and do all kinds of different things, but you'll eventually get down there. There are many different ways of achieving your attention to score points. The construction of a speech is another way. You can use a variety of different organizational schemes depending upon your particular goals. If you're speaking to a hostile audience and but you know that your evidence is really good, and you know that there are certain kinds of main points that your opposition has made, probably your best way to approach that, or at least one good way of approaching it, is to use a counter-argument form, where you take your opponent's main points and disprove them. I've found that to be useful in my own life when I have to disprove a powerful opponent. But that certainly isn't the only way of constructing a persuasive speech. You can have problem solution. You can have a Monroe's motivated sequence where you use policy. You can have all sorts of different kinds of ways that you accomplish your goal, which is a persuasive speech. You have a choice. So this is the most complicated for you in that you have a lot of choices. There aren't particular prescriptions, but at the same time, if you're creative and if you're sharp, you have a myriad of things to choose from. Also, the organization of a meeting. There are different kinds of ways that you can organize a meeting. And Dr. MHAUN teaches that in her effective meeting management class. Many different ways of organizing a meeting. And so given this brief overview of rules and what they are and the different ways that people have studied them, let's look at two specific rules applications, actual theories that people have created about rules. Probably the most specific of these theories is Shimanoff's integrative approach. Now, what is really good about this approach is she defines what a rule actually is. And she defines a rule as a followable prescription that indicates what behavior is obligated, preferred, or prohibited in certain contexts. That's very clear. It tells us exactly what a rule is. Now, this definition implies 4 elements. Rules must be followable. They must not be impossible. Now, suppose I wrote down this. Can you follow that rule? No. It's a paradox. It's one of those wonderful paradoxes like this page is intentionally left blank. I love that. I just got a report from a company where there was a page that actually said that. So I'm going to Xerox that for my students because that's my favorite paradox. This is another one. You cannot follow that rule because on one level you're going to break it. It's one of those you're darned if you do and you're darned if you don't. You cannot follow that rule. So that's the first thing. The rule must not be impossible. You have to be able to follow it. That's one reason why Alice in Wonderland is such a wonderful book, because it's just full of situations like that where people break rules, and the rules that they do make are constantly changing, so you can't possibly follow it, like the Queen's croquet game. Alice was absolutely befuddled because the rules kept changing. Okay, another implication of this particular definition is that rules are prescriptive. They tell us what we should do and what we should not do. And we grow up learning many of these kinds of rules. Some of these rules are the unwritten ones. They're those implicit rules. We learn when we're very little that when we go into, say, a courtroom, for example, we don't stand up on the desk and do a tap dance. That would be totally inappropriate, and we'd probably get cited for contempt of court. There's some situations that we speak softly in hushed tones. Can anybody think of any? Where would you speak softly in hushed tones? A library. Okay, there's nothing that irritates us more than to have somebody carry on a loud, animated conversation in a library. Okay, can anybody think of another situation? Yes. Church. Yes, usually you do not speak loudly in any kind of worshipful setting. So those are 2 situations. But there are other situations where you can be as loud and noisy as you want to be. For example? Pardon? Yeah, a football game. You can yell and scream and do whatever you want. Although, it depends what part of the country you're in. My oldest son has just gone from a Texas university to one in Illinois, to graduate school. And he said when he went to the Texas football games, people would yell and scream and say, "Get going," probably in a little more forceful language than that. And in the Illinois football game, everybody is terribly polite. He realized very quickly that he better sit down and behave like a gentleman, because they'd say, "Oh, missed that kick. Too bad." You know, and so he found it extremely funny because the rules that he was applying to his Texas, in his Texas upbringing were a little different than the ones that they apply in Illinois. And so, this is one thing that we have to be aware of, that rules are not only prescriptive, but they're also contextual. What may fit in one situation will not necessarily fit in another situation. Each situation has its own set of rules, both implicit and explicit. Now, we do have to remember that there are some rules that are universal across cultures. Most cultures have some sort of rule that says that we shouldn't kill each other, that we shouldn't steal from each other. We find this across cultures, regardless of who we are. So there are some universal rules, but a general rule is that rules are contextual. A fourth implication of Shimanoff's ideas are that rules specify appropriate behavior, what to do or what not to do. And so there's, again, some things that are appropriate and there's some things that are not appropriate. Now, in order to be able to verify a rules theory, one must be able to observe rules in operation. Now, if you were a person from another planet and you were observing the day-to-day operations of humankind, if you sat from your vantage point, you would be able to figure out what the rules or the regularities of daily behavior are. You know, that, for example, the human being lies on some sort of plank for anywhere from 4 to 8 hours a day, depending on if you're a student or not. Usually you get more the 4 rather than the 8. And then a little box makes a jangling noise, and the inert human being suddenly gets up and then consumes mass quantities of substances, to use an old laugh-in phrase, and then gets in a motorized vehicle and moves to another location where the person sits at a desk or performs some sort of task throughout the day, then goes back home to the original place, and then eventually ends up back on the plank inert. Okay, well, by observing these regularities every day, the alien could devise a set of rules to figure out your behavior. Any game has got rules. Football, bridge, backgammon, you know, any game has got rules. But we have to be able to see these rules in operation, and they have to be somewhat regular, or we can't figure out what they are. If they're always changing, like in Alice in Wonderland, then we can't figure out what the rules are, and we can't behave accordingly. Shimanoff also developed a complex model to assess rules criteria, and these are just a few of the questions she had. Are these rules contextual, or are they universal? Are these rules controllable, in that who makes up these rules and who enforces the rules? And also, are these rules seen as appropriate by the players? And that's what makes Alice in Wonderland so much fun, because the players go with the flow. They go with the madness of the rules, like the Mad Hatter or the March Hare. You know, they all follow these inexplicable rules, and they see them as appropriate, even though Alice sees them as totally inappropriate. So that's something else that we have to be aware of, that sometimes rules that we feel are totally inappropriate by either a society or a group, that group might find completely appropriate. So we always have to be aware of the complexity of rules and their appropriateness. The primary value of this approach is the clear operational definition of a rule. Now, a more complex theory is Peirce and Cronin's The Coordinated Management of Meaning. Now, this is a much more complex theory which looks at how people use rules in communication to coordinate their meanings. And there are several ideas that have to do with this particular theory. One is that communication is coordination, or communication as coordination. That we develop interaction rules to coordinate our behaviors and coordinate our meanings. Now, one of the more complex aspects of this theory is a hierarchical approach to meaning. And what Pearce and Cronin say is that all of our meanings are interrelated, and that they're part of a hierarchy of abstraction, and that we choose meaning rules and we also choose behavior rules according to this hierarchy. Now, we start out with archetypes or archetypes. These are images of how things are. These are our universal tenets for how we see the world. Now, an example of that, we're going to be dealing, say, with a little conflict situation here. Harmony should prevail all human relationships. That would be a universal image of how things should be according to, say, a certain person. Now, the next level down are what we call the life scripts. And these are episodes of behavior consistent with the self-concept. Now, what would be an episode consistent with the self-concept? Well, that would be conflict avoidance. If we believe that harmony should prevail all human relationships, then we're going to avoid conflict at all costs, if at all possible. Okay, the next level down are the episodes. Now, the episodes are repetitive patterns of behavior. Okay, episodes are repetitive patterns of behavior. Now, these would be repeated instances of avoidance of arguing, which of course is conflict avoidance. So you see here how each one implies the other, and of course you can go up or down. The arrows go both ways. Now, the next level down would be the contract. This is the defined requirement of a relationship. Now, how do we avoid arguing? Well, we have an implicit agreement relationally not to argue. When we find ourselves in our relationship in a conflict situation, somebody's going to back down. Then we have our actual speech acts, messages designed to fulfill an intention. And the intention, of course, is harmony, not to argue, conflict avoidance. And so our interactional rule here would be that if there is an objection or any threat of some sort of conflict, this would be followed by a withdrawal or an agreement by the other person. And then the actual content would be the message itself, the actual utterance. And an example of that might be something like maybe one person says, well, I really don't want to do that. And the other person says, okay, that's fine. So you can see that each one of these is more specific than the next. And we move from the most abstract to the concrete. That what we do in our specific exchanges with other people are guided by all kinds of underlying rules. And these rules come out of our way, our images of how things should be. And so what we say in many situations is not random. It comes from this overall view of how things should be and how we should behave in relationships. Now, Pearce and Cronin also developed a couple of other ideas about rules, that there's two different kinds of rules. One are constitutive rules. Okay, and what constitutive rules are what things count as. And I'm going to give you an example in a minute. And then regulative rules, how one should behave. Regulative rules are how one should behave. So we can look at almost any behavioral situation and figure out what it counts as. Now, if we have a constitutive rule that something is play, then something like pillow fighting is not aggressive it counts as a game. Okay. So we can look at any sequence of behavior, any action, and depending on what we assign the meaning of the constitutive rule, what it counts as, then we can look at any kind of aggression or any kind of conflict, and it's either a game or it is, in fact, hostility or aggression. There certainly is a lot of aggression in basketball, in football, and all of that. But that aggression is part of the play, part of the game, and so unless people are just unusually brutal, it's usually looked at as part of the game. And so this is another aspect of that theory and how we can use these rules in almost any different kind of situation. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to move from the linguistic approaches to some relational approaches. And one of my favorite areas of communication study is the field of relational communication. Now, Dr. Hahn has already talked about relational communication to a degree because she's looked at Watzlawick, Bevan, and Jackson and their various axioms of communication. And a lot of these theories come out of those basic works. I'm going to talk about them again in just a few minutes. There are two basic approaches for studying the rules of relationship in non-clinical settings. The first is this behavioral approach that does come from Watzlawick, Bevan, and Jackson, Bateson, and Millar and Rogers. And basically what these types of studies look at are the couple's interaction patterns. And what they're looking at through interaction is a struggle for control. When one gets very good at coding things, one can go into almost any situation and figure out what's going on. The whole idea being that the rules for the relationship or the rules for the interaction at that particular time are embedded, in fact, in the message exchange. Who has the right to control? Let me give you a little example of that. I have done research in this area for about the last 25 years, and I find it certainly one of the most enlightening areas that I have ever looked at. One of the research studies that I did, I went into people's homes and asked them about their latest disagreement and also to solve a little problem. Well, in one of the homes that I went into, I asked what their latest disagreement was. And it was over watching a particular television program. Now, do you really think that their agreement, the true agreement, was over watching the television program? No. It was over who has the right to choose. So it was a control problem. Who has the right to choose? And so what this area of study does, it looks at who has the right to choose, who's controlling, who's dominant, who's submissive. And we'll go back and talk about this in just a little bit in more detail. The second aspect of this particular approach for studying is the cognitive approach. Now, this approach comes from the work of Marianne Fitzpatrick, and she based her work on years of research in the sociological realm of creating typologies of relationship. The work of Lederer and Lair are some of those early examples. Now, what Marianne Fitzpatrick did was she created a self-report questionnaire that created a marital or a relational typology. that given these particular questions and how you answer these questions on the questionnaire, that's going to put you in particular kinds of groups or align you with certain kinds of types. Now, the typology is based on 7 scales reflecting things like interdependence and autonomy. These are one of the most important aspects of any kind of relationship. How interdependent are you going to be, and how autonomous are you going to be? If you're going to be late, do you call your spouse or your partner and say, I'm going to be half an hour late, 50 minutes late, don't worry about me? Or do you instead say, they won't worry, I'll just do my own thing? The extreme autonomous person would be the, I'll do my own thing. The very interdependent couple or the very interdependent relationship would always call. So that's one of the first important dimensions that we talk about. Another has to do with access and target, or sharing. How much sharing do you have in the relationship? How much space do you share? When we lived up at a lake community when we were first married, and we had a small townhouse, and we had two children. We were all on top of each other. We had our general room where we had the television and the playpen and the toys and what a mess. But it was fun. Those early years you deal with those things. We had some friends in the neighborhood who were fortunate to have a little larger house than we did. Everybody had their own space. He had her workroom, she had his workroom. The children had their playroom, and nobody entered anybody else's space. They had not a great deal of sharing, at least of space. Now, that doesn't mean that they didn't share as a family in certain kinds of activities, but in terms of space, in coordinating their space in their lives, their stuff was in different places. Okay, whereas partly because we had such a small house and partly because of our relationship, all our stuff was intermingled, and it really didn't bother us any. I think even though we have a much larger house now, everybody's stuff is still all over the place. My youngest son's shoes are still in the dining room. They've been in the dining room for the last 15 years, and they still stay there. Fortunately, I'm not too picky. But this is an extreme case of sharing. Now, we also go into activities as well. Activities of how much do you do together? Do you have similar interests, or do you kind of do your own thing? Or do you have some similar interests, and do you have some things that each person does individually? Traditionalism and change. Traditionalism has to do with how regular your lives are. Do you get up at the same time every day? Do you eat dinner at the same time every day? Do you have the same bedtime every day? Or are your lives very complex, where you're all over the place depending upon the context? That has to do with traditionalism and change. Assertiveness and compliance. How assertive are you? Do you stand up for your rights no matter what, or do you back down? And then conflict management. How willing are you to engage in conflict? Will you engage in conflict over everything, even if it's not important? Or do you let some things slide because they're not important? Well, based on this questionnaire and based on all of these different scales, 3 relational types emerged from her research. The independents, the separates, and the traditionals. And let's talk a little bit about each one of these. The independents are probably the most complex of the couple types to make them work successfully, because they have a peculiar balance of autonomy and sharing. Fitzpatrick says that none of these relationships are better than any other. There are happy types within each of them, and there are unhappy types within each of them. It just depends on people's needs. The interdependents, or the independents, tend to interact more. They talk a lot. One reason why they talk a lot is because they have complicated rules. Many times they are both going in different relationships. Many times it's a two-career family where they better get their rules straight or everybody's not going to do what they need to do to make the relationship work. Who's going to pick up the kids today? In fact, my husband at least we have a moderate independent relationship. We're probably kind of a combination of this and another type, the traditionals. But we had a problem this morning because I usually take my son to driver's ed, but that's at 9:30. I couldn't do that this morning because of the taping. And so we had to get our acts together. If we had not talked a lot about who was going to get him there and who was going to pick him up, I'm picking him up because he had a funeral, we would not have coordinated that situation. The independents have complex lives and they have to talk a lot in order to coordinate their behaviors. They also tend to engage in more conflict because of the complexity of their lives. They're also not afraid of conflict. They look at conflict as a way to clear the air, get things out of the way, and then they can go on. They also tend to have fewer periods of silence. They tend to talk at all. They tend to be very spontaneous. They don't have a lot of silence in their relationship. They also have more trouble agreeing upon relationship rules, probably because they are both very assertive. They both want to be in control. They both tend to be on the dominant side. And so it's a real task talking out who's going to do what and how they're going to do it, and is it equitable and fair to both parties. And they also tend to have more power and control struggles because of all of that. Now the separates are a different type. These are a very autonomous relationship. They tend to keep their feelings and ideas to themselves. That doesn't mean that they can't be perfectly happy. They tend to be very private people and generally non-emotional people. They tend to interact less. They don't seem to need to. They have longer silences. They have longer periods where they don't talk to each other. They tend to maintain greater distances. The separates are the type of family that everybody would have their own space. And they would tend not to invade the space of anybody else without explicit permission. They tend to maintain greater distances, avoid most conflict. One of the things about the separates is that they don't fight. An example of that, when I did my major research study for my dissertation, I found with every single separate type that came out of my study, they didn't fight. You know, when I asked them to discuss their latest disagreement, they talked about, for at least 10 minutes, about, well, we don't seem to argue. Well, what have we argued about last? Not a single couple could have come up with a disagreement, which I found extremely interesting. They also tend to demonstrate more rigid interaction patterns, and partly because their rules are very specific. To maintain this distance but still maintain a happy relationship, their rules are etched in concrete and they do not break them. They follow specific rules and very rigid rules in order to have everything work. And they do tend to be more emotionally divorced. They would not share as much with their spouse as do the other couple types. Now the traditionals are the couple type that we often see stereotypically the Brady Bunch, Ward and June Cleaver, and Leave It to Beaver. They're kind of the classic stereotypic couple that we've seen through the years in movies and films. They tend to share relational control and other aspects of their lives. This is the most important thing about the traditionals. They try to be very equitable in their relationships. One person might be in control in one area, whereas somebody else might be in control in another area. You take care of the finances, I'll take care of this. But there's a sense that we're going to share the rules and the aspects of the relationship. They have few long silences in their relationship. They have more silences than the independents, but at the same time, they don't have as many silences as the traditional. But the silences that they do have, they seem comfortable with. They're comfortable both with silence and with talking. They are very emotionally interdependent. They depend upon each other for confirmation, for success, for sharing of ideas, for sharing of parts of their lives. This is a very important part of the traditionals. They also successfully manage relational conflict. What I found in my research with the traditionals with conflict was that they argued over significant things, but they did not argue over things that they felt were not significant. Like in my research study, I had what we call a neutral question and a conflict question. The neutral question were, what 3 books would you take to another planet? Who cares, right? The traditionals would say, I say this, you say that. Usually they said something like the Bible, a medical dictionary, and some sort of how-to book. And then the other person would say something like, well, yes, I can agree on, the medical dictionary and the Bible, but I really think we need something else. And they'd talk for a little while and they'd say, okay, well, let's take 2 of yours and 2 of mine, and then let's come up with a third one that maybe we haven't thought of yet. And then they'd easily solve the problem with little emotion, little fanfare, little problem. It was not a real burning issue. What I found with the independents was they would argue at length about what 3 books to take to the other planet. Really, who cares what 3 books you take to another planet? But the independents were determined to have their way. If they felt that a particular book should be taken, they were going to hold out for it assertively no matter what. In fact, I had one couple talk for a full hour about what 3 books to take to another planet, which I found amusing. And also very like the independents, because they are so assertive with one another and they are so determined to get their way. With the separates, on the other hand, what you find is they would say, well, I say this books and I say this books. Then there would be a silent. And they'd look at each other and one would say, we can go with yours. So there would be no sense of conflict at all. Most interesting that each one of them had their own particular way of talking to each other. And all these things that we've talked about, all the things that are important to each type, governed the way that they talk to each other. This type tends to be the most supportive, satisfied, and empathic of the couple types. And it's interesting, when I did a follow-up study, I also found that most people thought they were traditionals, even though only 15% of my sample were traditionals. Interesting? So this is a fascinating area of study because it tells us so much about relationships, how people talk to each other, and how they manage the rules of their relationship in a very global way. And that's one of the strengths. We're looking at all sorts of different aspects of the relationship beyond control, although certainly this type of method impacts control as well. Now, the other approach, the behavioral approach, is often what we refer to as relational communication. It began 60 years ago with the field studies of Gregory Bateson. And Bateson went to New Guinea and observed in an ethnographic way the couples relating to one another. He felt that if he went into a different culture, his own biases wouldn't cloud his perceptions. And he was a psychologist and a clinical psychologist. And he discovered that people define their relationships through interaction, and that the interaction patterns could be of two types. A complementary pattern is one where there are differences. An example of differences would be I ask a question, you answer a question. In a more global relational way, dominance, submission. A symmetrical pattern would be doing similar things. I assert, you agree, I agree. Or a whole relationship would be dominance, dominance, submissive, submissive. A dominance approach many times leads to conflict. A submissive approach leads to everybody relinquishing control. Have you ever had one of those conversations where you say, where do you want to go to dinner? Oh, I don't care. Where do you want to go? Oh, you choose. I don't care. Oh, no, I don't care. You choose. Well, and you spend the next hour submitting to the other person, and you're probably 2 hours late getting out to dinner because nobody wants to choose. That would be an example of submissive symmetry. And then there's kind of a neutralized symmetry where control is not an issue. Now, Bateson's original findings were expanded by Watzlawick, Bevan, and Jackson in their classic book that Dr. Hahn has already talked about, The Pragmatics of Human Communication, where they talked about families as systems, and also that you could not have communication, and there are two levels of communication, which Dr. Hahn has already talked about. They go on to say that people create interaction rules, and these rules direct behavior. Now, Bateson and his colleagues used these insights in clinical settings. Now, what we had to find, though, is that in the relational communication study in our field, we had to develop coding schemes, and one of the major coding schemes was developed by Millar and Rogers. Another very good one was developed by Ellis. And what they did was they coded relational statements according to type. You know, this would be like a dominance move, this would be a submissive move, and this would be a non-control move. And I've got an example here of submissive symmetry, or symmetrical interaction. And this would be what we call these were structuring moves. They're a weak dominance or assertive type of interaction. We both worked at the same place. My wife ran a comptometer, and I repaired comptometers. Okay, now, she doesn't just say, I agree. She gives her own view of the situation. We worked in the same building. Okay, she also makes an assertive move. And then he goes on and he gives more information, a further assertive move. She worked for a firm which had a large installation, and I worked there most of the time, and so that is where we met. Now, she is going to add some information to that. She doesn't stick with what he just said. She makes her own assertional statement. We were introduced by some of the other girls up there. Okay, this is a much different kind of interaction, this symmetrical interaction, than the next one we see on the screen, which is complementary interaction. Okay, the first sentence is a probe sentence by the therapist. Okay, when did you start there? Now, this is the first speaker. I haven't any idea. That is an extreme submissive move. Makes no statement at all. Totally withdraws from any kind of commitment. It's a statement of being an abdicrat. Now, the other person interrupts with a strong dominance move. It seems to me that it was in October and I started in January. Again, an extreme submissive move. I don't remember. She's withdrawing. And then I sent her flowers. Again, a dominance move. Yes, agreeing. And then a year later we got married. Dominance. Okay. What's interesting about this is these are two different kinds of interaction patterns. And so when we do research in this particular area, we're looking for either symmetrical or complementary interaction patterns. There are coding schemes out there that help you figure out what each sentence stands for. They're rather complicated. You have to have training in this area, but I've found it to be certainly an enlightening type of research. And you can, once you get good at it, the coding, you can go into any meeting, any situation, a party, and code. And you can tell what's going on. You go, oh, a little conflict going on there. Or you go, this is interesting. Why is so-and-so withdrawing all the time? When I was working on my dissertation, I coded all the time. And my husband would say, now try not to code, dear, when we were going to a party, because I'd stand back there and watch everybody. I don't do that anymore. I'm not involved so much with that kind of research anymore, so I don't code anymore at parties. But it is very useful. It is a very useful tool because when you become sensitive to how people are coordinating their interaction, what kinds of control struggles are going on, it helps you be a more sensitive and more empathic communicator in any kind of situation. It's a most interesting area. Okay, now I'd like to move on to, it seems like a totally different area, but it isn't really, because these are rules of personality. There are ways that we structure our own responses to different kind of situations based on personality archetypes. And this comes originally from Jung's research, and this is the Myers-Briggs analysis. Now, if you are interested in this area, if you're interested in figuring out what type you are, you can go to your local university counseling center and take a test. And it's called the Myers-Briggs personality indicators. And it's most interesting because it tells you basically how you're going to react to a situation. Now, these are only tendencies. We have tendencies toward things. Just because you find yourself in one type, that doesn't mean you're going to be that type forever. You might change because of certain circumstances. When I was younger, I had a baby, I was teaching, and I was working on my dissertation. I was a much more extreme type than I am today. I'm a little looser because my life is not so structured. I don't have to make every second count. So you'll find, through the years that you switch back and forth. You may become more intense or less intense depending upon the demands of your life. But you do have a tendency one way or the other. Let's talk about these just briefly. The first pair of personality indicators. Has to do with extroversion and introversion. Now, this is not extroversion and introversion the way we usually think of it. I have met lots of introverts who are extremely vivacious, talkative, vital people. My oldest son is an introvert. He is one of the most talkative, most gregarious people I have ever met. When he went to Illinois from Texas, didn't know a person there. I was worried about him because we didn't have any family there or anything. After the first week, he had cloned his group of friends from his Texas university to Illinois. He had a group of 4 already in a week. He's very gregarious, but he's an introvert. The difference between extroversion and introversion certainly has to do with sociability, but it also has to do with where you receive energy in your life. When you go to a party, do you get so charged that you want to go to another party? Okay. The true extrovert has to have people around them, and they are lonely when they're not with others. The true extrovert does not want to do research studies alone. They want to do them with friends. We are extroverts, and we love to work together because we're extroverts. Some of the most painful times in my life were when I was working alone on a research study. I took a sabbatical a few years ago, and I had to literally work alone all the time. I found myself going up to my university, and people would say, "Why are you here?" And I need people. I needed to talk to people. I wanted to share my findings of what I had found on my research study.
Let me interject. There's not just anybody that'll go to lunch and talk about this stuff.
Yes.
Like,
So,
we're the only people we know that talk about communication theory over lunch.
And of course, I would have lunch with Dr. MHAUN because she would talk to me about my research. I'm an extrovert. I have to talk to people about what I'm doing. I get energized. I get more ideas when I talk to other people. The introvert, on the other hand, is not necessarily not sociable like my son. He's extremely sociable, but he's very territorial. He needs private places. We got to know through the years when he went into his room that we certainly did not enter without knocking, and we probably didn't bother him when he went into his room. He is very territorial. He needed his time alone. And from the time he was little, things were mine, mine. And that used to be our joke. Even when he got to be much older, he would come home and look at his TV that his younger brother was using, which he didn't really care, but he'd come in and say, "Mine." And so the introvert tends to be more territorial. They want their stuff where it is and nobody to touch it. The introvert tends to need time alone. They need to retreat, to read, to be alone. Interaction drains their energy. That doesn't mean they don't like people, that they don't have friends, many times very close friends, but they need to retreat to energize. And that's the big difference between extroversion and introversion. Okay, the next set of pairs are the differences between sensation, S, and intuitive, N. Now, this can cause people problems in their lives. All of these can, if you don't understand where somebody else is coming from. The extrovert can be hurt by the introvert, and vice versa, if they don't understand where the person is coming from. The introvert needs time alone. The extrovert needs plenty of time with other people. We just have to understand that that's part of the nature. And in knowing that, we can help our own relationships, that these would be part of the rules of relationship. The sensation person is just the facts man. Give me the facts. They are very practical people. They don't want a lot of falderall. They don't want to hear numerous theoretical explanations for why things are so. They just want the facts. They want to know what actually happened, not what might have happened, what could have happened. They don't care. They just want the facts. And they're very detail-oriented people. Anybody like that? Okay. The intuitive person will drive you nuts, if you are a sensation person. These people are off in the cosmos. They are going to talk about every single possibility for every situation. If you're in a group meeting with them and you have to decide on a course of action, they are going to come up with every possible course of action that might be followed. They tend to see the whole. They tend to be very creative. They're important people, the intuitive person. They tend to worry about what might have been or what will be. They tend not to focus so much on what is right now, and that's one of their failings. They tend to miss details. I'm a high end. I have to check myself all the time or I'll forget things. I have to make lists, and sometimes I'll even forget to look at the list. That is a characteristic of a high end. You're off in the cosmos. You're worrying about, solving the problems of life. You tend to not worry so much about the detail of every day. You also, if you're an intuitive person, skip from one activity to the next, and you have a tendency to be able to do 12 things at once fairly successfully. And it doesn't bother you at all. Drives my husband nuts. He is a sensation person. I clean the house. I go from room to room. I go over here and over here and over here and over here, and I get it all done. But I find it boring to stay in one room at a time and get that room done. I rather fly around the house like a tornado. That drives him nuts. He says, why don't you finish one room at a time and then go to the next room? So that's one of our little things. When I house clean with him, we go from one room at a time, and I bite my knuckle.
You're probably cooking and doing laundry at the same time.
Of course I am. Of course I am. So, I'll tell him, excuse me for just a minute, and he'll be happy for 2 seconds while I put in another load of laundry. So, I don't know. It just depends on the type and what you feel comfortable with. Neither type is right or wrong. But you do have to be aware of how you are and how other people may be so that you can coordinate your activities successfully. The next one is thinking and feeling. This one can also cause difficulties in relationships. The thinking person is logical and objective. This person wants principles. This person is impersonal. This is the person who is concerned about justice rather than mercy. And this person tends not to show so many feelings. One of my favorite character pairings is in Les Miserables. Javert was the thinking person. Logic, the man broke the law. He should go to jail. He should be punished. No matter what else he did, he broke the law. The feeling person decides on what to do based on personal or emotional impact on people's lives. You may put yourself at jeopardy. You may put yourself in a bind because you don't want to hurt somebody else or you don't want to disrupt their lives. You think about things subjectively. You tend to be people-oriented. You're not so worried about justice, although certainly justice is important. You're more concerned about mercy. So it's one of those dichotomies. And probably most of us are in the middle, where justice and mercy, follow right there in the middle. The feeling person can tend to be emotional or over-emotional sometimes. So the feeling person has to worry about being too emotional. The thinking person has to not let logic make one blind to the important feelings in the situation. And then the last pairing are the judging and perceiving people. The judging person has his or her calendar set for a year or two. You know exactly where you are 2 years from now and what you're going to be doing. The perceiving person is the old shoot from the hip. I don't know what I'm going to do the next hour.
My ex-husband.
The judging person sets deadlines and keeps them. This person is very orderly and has a very strong work ethic. You can depend on this person. If this person says they'll be there, they'll be there. No matter what the situation, they might be a little late, but they'll be there. And they are also always prepared. They do their homework. They are prepared. This person is also outcome oriented. They want something to happen from a particular situation. And they also tend to be a little set in their ways. And this is the thing that the person has to worry about, not to be too set in their ways so that they can't be flexible if the situation demands it. You know, because we all know sometimes that things don't quite go the way we want. There may be an act of nature, like a flood, that sort of destroys our schedule. And so what do we do about it? Well, we have to be flexible. We have to.
I found it very disconcerting.
And I'm sure you did. But you put in that perceiving chip and said, okay, even with my schedule, how can I be spontaneous? How can I be flexible and make this all work? The perceiving person on the extreme is a little too unorganized. They never know what they're doing. They never know what they're doing next. They tend to shoot from the hip. But the very positive things about the perceiving person is that they're very spontaneous. They can go into a situation, and if something isn't working, they'll do something else. And they can do it immediately because they are so sharp about picking up cues and being able to change midstream so things will work. They also tend to be very process-oriented. They're able to stick with the process, even though the process may be tedious and boring, but in order to move it to the final goal or intention. The true perceiving person might not even realize in the beginning what their true goal or intention is till they get into the process. Then they figure out what it is, and then they move it that way. I would feel uncomfortable with that. I am not an extreme judging person. I'm probably just on the, probably the left side of center. But I certainly wouldn't come to a situation like this and not have notes. That would make me very nervous. But most of the examples that I give you pop into my head. They're just off the top of my head. So I've got that perceiving aspect as well. So, and that comes from, you know, lots of impromptu drama through the years, part of my past. The one thing that the perceiving person has got to be aware of is not to put off deadlines. The perceiving person tends to be a procrastinator. Anybody procrastinators? Okay, make your schedule at least a few days ahead of time, you know, so that you know where you need to be and what you need to do so you don't miss an important appointment. And so all of these different areas gives us information about where we fit in relationships and what we need to do to be flexible. If you're an extrovert, realize that that introvert needs some space. Introvert, don't get hurt if you find your partner liking to be with a whole group of people. They need it. The sensation and the intuitive person, the sensation person realize that the intuitive person needs to do a certain amount of theorizing, needs to figure out what might have been, what could have been, where could we have gone, and realize that that will drive the sensation person quite mad. So don't do it too much in the relationship. And realize that the sensation person wants to focus on the what is now, and let's talk about now. Thinking and feeling, the thinking person needs to be aware of the feeling person's emotions and not to ignore that's a very important part of their lives. The feeling person needs to not get too upset with the thinking person when they're going to analyze every problem that they have analytically and not show a certain amount of emotion. Okay. If that's going, then you need to use your eye language, use your relational communication skills and say, hey, I need a hug. You know, I'm so glad that you're helping me solve my problem, but I also need a hug. You know, so communication can solve many of these misunderstandings. And then with the judging and the perceiving, somewhere in the middle is Aristotle's golden mean, where we have our schedule, where we know what we're doing, but at the same time we can go with the flow if we have to. So these are very useful indicators, personality indicators that can help us both solve problems in relationships and be aware of potential problems in relationships. Okay, one last area that I'd like to talk about are the qualities of relationships. And this comes from the research of Frank Millar and Edna Rogers. Remember, I mentioned their names before. They're part of that whole behavioral tradition that comes with the relational communication area. They were the first ones to develop a really usable coding scheme whereby those of us who knew nothing about therapy could go into almost any situation and figure out what was going on relationally. And so they did a great deal of work in a variety of areas. Most of their theorizing and research comes from the area of control. One of their most interesting studies was done on domineeringness and its relationship to dominance. That certainly dominance is a more abstract quality. It's a need for control, whereas domineeringness would be what we would do within a particular situation. And so they studied control from a variety of different points of view in a variety of different settings. And they found out that in relationships that we all need control. Now, this is a theory that I know that you've talked about before with William Schutz. William Schutz also, as part of his theory, said that we all need to be able to influence other people. We don't want to feel like we're doormats, that we have absolutely no influence or control in a relationship. Well, Millar and Rogers found that as well, that we all need to be able to define and direct interaction in some way. Now, we don't have to do it all the time, but we need to do it at least part of the time. And that has to do with the flexibility of relationships. And interestingly, Bateson and Watzlawick, Bevan, and Jackson, all psychotherapists, some psychiatrists, they all found that the happiest relationships and the most clinically functional relationships were ones where there was shared control, where there was this sense of flexibility. They also found that there is redundancy in relationships. There are repeated control tactics that are used. This can be both good and bad. If the control tactics are flexible, shared, and functional, this makes the quality of the relationship very happy. But, on the other hand, if those types of tactics are rigid, master-slave, where one person is dominant all the time and the other person is submissive all the time, then that relationship tends to be less functional and can move toward the dysfunctional. And so those are not happy relationships. And then, of course, dominance is one of the big keys in control, and shared dominance usually is the most satisfying kind of relationship. Although, what people have found with 40-some years of research, the rules of relationship that work for each relationship are particular to that relationship. That what might work for one couple will not necessarily work for another couple. So, usually flexibility is the best, where we have some sort of shared control. Okay, another area that they did some study on was trust. And trust is certainly an important part of any relationship. It has to do with disclosure. Disclosure and trust go hand in hand. How vulnerable you are is a big aspect of trust. If you are willing to disclose to someone who has power over you, or if this is a risky type of situation, if you are sharing negative information with, say, a new intimate, that puts you in a very vulnerable situation. The person could turn you down or say, I want no part of this relationship. If in fact, in our trusting relationships, we are very vulnerable and we get the reward dependability that we want. We, in fact, are confirmed by the other person when we have, in fact, been vulnerable. Then this gives us a good sense and a happy sense for the quality of the relationships. And this gives us a tremendous sense of confidence. I've got a funny little cartoon here. I don't know whether you'll be able to see it, but this is not what we want in relationships. There are two ladies, and they're looking at clothing, and one says, "How about this one?" "You got to be kidding," says the other one. "What's wrong with it?" "It's cheap and trashy, and I wouldn't be caught dead in it." "Well, I didn't mean for you. I meant for me." "Oh, for you? Oh, on you it would look good." Classic disconfirmation. We certainly don't want that in our relationships. And I've got another one that's just great too. This one also has to do with disconfirmation. We want, again, confirmation. When we put ourselves on the line with other people in relationship, we want confirmation. I think some of the best Comm theory comes out of Hagar the Horrible. This is a classic disconfirmation, and this is between Lucky Eddie and Hagar. "You're a good friend to me, Hagar." "Thanks, Lucky Eddie. You're a good friend too. And you have a good sense of humor." "Thanks. You have a good sense of humor too. And you're also very smart." "Thanks." "Nice hat." Again, classic disconfirmation. And of course, poor Lucky Eddie, who is bearing his soul to Hagar, does not get the confirmation that he needs from that exchange. So trust talks a lot about disclosure, confirmation, and how we can risk ourselves with other people and not be destroyed. Intimacy is the last area. And intimacy has to do with a variety of areas, certainly physical and psychological. Transferability is one of the most important aspects of intimacy. This is the ability to convey your thoughts and emotions to someone else. Do you have that special person that you can just look at that person and they know exactly what you're feeling? If you have someone like that, that is one of the greatest blessings in your life. Just a look, an exchange, and the other person knows exactly what you're feeling. Attachment is another area. How integrated you are. Do you have a joint commitment to your relationship? Are you a little bit different with this person than you are alone? You have your own identity and you have your joint identity. That has to do with how intimate your relationship is. When you come together with the other person, you create a special entity that is beyond both of you. That is the very special attached area, that joint identity. And then lastly, knowledge of the other person. You know when the other person will be happy or unhappy. You know what will please them or not please them. My husband, for Mother's Day, did something really nice that pleased me. We had gone to an art exhibit, and he got me my favorite Monet print and had it framed for Mother's Day. I was very pleased. And he knew what would make me happy. I was extremely pleased. We have covered a variety of theories, of rules theories. These are very complicated ones, but they impact the nature, the quality, and the success and effectiveness of our relationships.
Thank you very much.